Today we're looking at All-Star Superman number 2, which explores Superman as horror. Hey comic fans, welcome to Dangerous Comics. I'm your host, Dane Georges, and today we are continuing our coverage of All-Star Superman with issue 2. This one, we got the byline of, "Can you guess the secret of Superman's forbidden room?" And just starting with the cover, this is such a cool shift of the tone, right? We kind of started with a more majestic cover for the first issue. I think it was a little bit more golden age in its approach, but this one I think we're leaning straight into the Silver Age, and more specifically with kind of some of Superman's supporting books, maybe not even Superman or Action Comics, but more specifically Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane. And this issue is all about Lois. You know, she's now going to be taken to the Fortress of Solitude, and Superman has a plan for her. And maybe she kind of is a little suspicious of what that plan is. And I think you kind of get that all spelled out for us in the cover, right? We've got Lois here, she's holding a gun, and Superman is hunched over his workbench with a really ominous shadow being cast from whatever he's working on. Kind of giving us a little bit of like Superman as horror, or like a Beauty and the Beast kind of like dichotomy here of these two, which maybe we're not used to seeing, but was something that was a little bit more common in the Silver Age. And I have a few issues here. Maybe they're not perfect examples of Lois Lane's girlfriend, but I found these at a thrift store not too long ago, and I thought they were cool kind of examples of like, you know, what Lois's adventures were like. And so this book was really interesting. It was like focused on Lois, but not without Superman, right? And not even Lois on her own totally. It's Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane. Just like how it was Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen. So these would be stories about Lois Lane, but always kind of with Superman. The draw was still Superman. I mean, his name is on the book. But obviously you see here, so much of it was like Lois trying to figure out Superman's identity, even though she was still doing that in the main Superman book, even more here, and her just like really trying to do everything she could do to like marry Superman, like kind of just hitting home a lot of these ideas of just like the woman's role in this early like 60s world of comics. So we've got these two examples, which is like Lois, I think it's actually like a dream story. So what I have here is Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane issues 64, 65, and 66. And you can kind of see just like the range of where the stories went. These two actually are connected. And I think they actually all end up being like a dream scenario. So it's not even like real, but it's like Lois gets connected and starts dating to Lexo, who is like a super villain Lex Luthor. I think it's basically Lex Luthor. I think maybe that's the reveal, but he's like a superhero that is Lex Luthor. And whole thing is like, you know, he's trying to get proof against who Superman is. She's got extra. Superman exposes Lexo, clue to the secret identity of Lexo. It's like, who could it be? Of course it's Lex Luthor. But, you know, then like her actually like fighting Superman. So always kind of trying to play on those expectations. And then this last one is a really cool example of kind of where this issue goes in the end too, of like, and where a lot of Jimmy Olsen issues would go, but like these characters kind of experiencing like a crazy transformation, like getting superpowers or like becoming a monster or something like that. And this is like a great example. Lois is like going to go save these people in this building. This guy's falling, and she's using like her monstrous animal feet to do it. It's so good. So it's like she just like becomes this freak and is afraid of Superman seeing her become that. So she's like eating these flowers and just some weird stuff in here. But I do think that these are the kind of stories that Grant Morrison is playing on when writing this issue of All-Star Superman 2. This, I almost wish we got the title of Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane on the cover here, because I do think that is kind of what this issue is trying to do. And why I think it's kind of cool to look at these as independent issues rather than contained in a graphic novel or trade paperback, because I think there was some intent with each of these issues to kind of do something a little bit different and explore the history of comics in a different way. So we start off, we ended first issue with Superman exposing to Lois that he is Clark Kent. He opened his work shirt up and showed that classic S. She dropped the groceries, and we got a to be continued. And this is the instant continuation. Lois is in her car. She's driving. We see that there's mountain ranges behind it, and we get the reveal that Superman is flying her car to the Arctic. And she's saying, Clark Kent, you've always been Clark Kent? Sorry, I just don't believe you, Superman. And so I think that's kind of like what we were talking about in the first issue too, of just like how well Frank Quietly would show that like bumbling Clark Kent to the Superman. And I think, Lois has had like years and years of like her own comic where she would like think that she found out that Superman is Clark Kent, only to have it be debunked by the end of the issue, right? So this reveal that you just got the last issue is like not connecting. She's like, I thought we went through this. I thought we tried to prove that you were Clark, and you showed me a million times that you weren't. And so I don't care how many times he tries to convince me. I've been through this before. I've spent years trying to prove it, and now he's getting his own back with the cruelest trick he's ever played. And so that's just an interesting, play on like their history, the actual big history of Lois and Clark together. And so he's flying her over here and going to his Fortress of Solitude. And so this is actually more of a pre-crisis original Golden Age Fortress of Solitude. A lot of you might be more familiar with the Fortress of Solitude looking like a bunch of crystals, crystals that are crisscrossing and it's like gleaming, and that's what it looked like in the Richard Donner Superman movie. It's what it's looked like in Man of Steel. In most interpretations, in the more current modern look at Superman, his fortress has been more crystal based off of like Kryptonian technology, but this is kind of going back into more of the Golden Age look at what the Fortress of Solitude looked like, which was in a mountain that Superman carved out, and he would use a gigantic golden key to open it up. So we get here, and I could probably point this out on every single page, but there is some different coloring in the actual collected versus the printed comic, or the original first printing. You can see, and I think it's just kind of throughout, there was like a lot of like blue in the color that has then been taken out in the collected. So it's just, and it does look better in the collected. I would say this is a better move. It's just like this becomes very washed out, whereas like you're losing like all of the fine line detail that Frank Quietly put in here, and it's way more visible in this kind of coloring. So I don't know what happened. I don't know if it's just like how these digital colors were printing and landing on the page. Maybe it's a different paper quality, paper stock that's in the trade paperback, but throughout there's a lot of instances of like details kind of being lost that then kind of come back in the trade paperback that I think some recoloring kind of fixed. We get here and she's saying, I'll go along with this, but there better be a devastating punchline. So she's really not believing it. And she's also saying, hey, what happened to the big golden key? The one that he is like only a Kryptonian, like only like Superman or Supergirl could actually pick it up to get into the fortress. And he's like, oh, I got a new key. And it's just this little normal key, and he opens it up. And we get the Superman robots that come out, and he asks them to grab the car and fix it up. And she's like, well, why'd you change the key? It's like, isn't that like a little less secure? And he said, it's made of super dense dwarf star material and weighs 500,000 tons. I'm the only person on Earth who can lift it, and that's the way I like it. And so I really could show this for like literally probably like every page, but there's just like, there is such a color difference here. And you can see especially here how blue that back wall is, and then it becomes a little bit more brown in here. And I do think that kind of helps with some of the foreground background separation even here. But so it's just like the printed first edition printing of this is just way more blue and less like saturated, especially in the reds. And I think that's something that they fixed in the trade. So we get this awesome kind of double page splash of Superman's trophy room, and this is kind of also, like I was saying, going back to the golden age, more of like Superman's trophies. This is actually the Titanic. He has the Columbia. This is a United States space shuttle. He's got like a Joker coin. He's got these chess pieces that are like Jimmy Olsen, Perry White, Brainiac, Bizarro, Lois Lane, Batman, Lex Luthor, and then I think this is Solaris as well, who ends up being a villain later. But maybe that's a little cue to like what is to come. But we see that his whole, and I think this is the time sphere that DC characters like Rip Hunter used to travel through time. And we can't forget we have the shrunken city of Kandor right here, which is like Supergirl's city that was shrunken down by Brainiac. So really cool kind of like look at like, okay, what is like Superman's Batcave like? It is a little bit of an interesting angle. It's like gets a little flattened out by like the gigantic Titanic that is in this background, and there's so much like open ground. But really cool to kind of see like what would Superman hold in high regard. I just think it maybe would be interesting if you like move the camera to be a little bit more angled and not so straight on, but can't complain with some Frank Quietly art. We also just get this very strange move here where they get rid of the credit box here. And following what we did in the first issue, they also refer to this as episode 2. So I think that's just a good continuation of what they were doing before. I really like this approach, and with the DC, good for general audiences. I just think that shouldn't be something that we cut in a trade paperback. I don't know why we're trying to pretend like this isn't a individual comic within amongst other issues. It's just weird to me that we cut that. But you can see this is a little bit more saturated and a little bit like richer color than this. This feels a little bit more washed out. And continuing, Lois goes, she gets ready. We get this great, most of this story is kind of told from Lois's perspective, and kind of a story that she's writing up on her computer. That's kind of like the through line in this issue. We get a great, like, I think this is just like classic Frank Quietly, how he draws like water or like that kind of like motion in something like that. Most people would probably draw this very differently. He uses it very well to like use it to cover up the female anatomy that maybe DC wouldn't want to be showing in a DC Superman comic. But I think the flow of it is really cool, how it's like splashing off of her. And that's something that Frank Quietly does really well. Also just cool in this panel how he's using the snowflakes as kind of like this element that's cutting through the little window that we see Lois through. He's giving her this plant. She also has this plant on her desk that is glowing because it's like an alien plant. Superman gives her these flowers that he picked for her on Alpha Centauri 4. And so she's still kind of questioning his intent. And she says, is he setting me up for another big joke? So just kind of like their whole dynamic. Superman's always been afraid to bring her close to him, afraid to hurt her. But now that he's dying, he is a little bit more willing to bring her into his life and wanting to have that connection with her, and the most intimate connection of her actually knowing him. So we get this cool little view of a couple of the different objects. This gun will come back into play. This is a kryptonite laser. And kind of wondering, why are you keeping these kind of weapons in your household? This little box is actually like an entire solar system, like a universe. This comes up in another Grant Morrison comic. They come in here, and he has this kind of like magic mirror as well, also here. But he shows that he's got this communicator that he can communicate with the future, and we see that he's talking to Cal Kent, the Man of Steel of tomorrow. And this guy comes from DC 1 Million. I guess it would come before this, but that was a Justice League event that Grant Morrison did. So Superman from the future. And also kind of like confronting Lois with like, okay, well, where did this kid come from? Where did this lineage come from? Is this like because they end up having a kid together? Kind of putting that in her mind. And like, I think that comes into the horror element of it, right? It's like, is Superman really giving her a choice in any of this? It's like just confronting her with the future, and she's like, oh, well, like, this is all new to me. I didn't know we were ever going to actually get together, and now you're showing me we have kids that have kids that have kids that end up being Superman kind of stuff. Like, just her feeling like lied to, or her feeling like, is this one big joke? I can't tell what you're trying to set up. And also a really cool line here where he's saying, the fortress isn't a museum, Lois, it's a time capsule. One day, some future man or woman will open that door with the key. When they do, I want them to know how it felt to live at the dawn of the age of superheroes. And other just cool stuff. This is just kind of like a big, fun, Grant Morrison loves throwing just big ideas on the page, kind of like in the vein of Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby would throw it all on the page, throw a million ideas in there, and like any of them could have been picked up to be a story later. And that's kind of what Grant is doing here too, kind of just showing like all the different tasks that Superman's doing around the fortress. He's like feeding this Sun Eater by actually like smashing on his forge. He's like making a little sun to feed the Sun Eater. It's like, what do you feed him? Suns. What else? Miniature suns I create here on this cosmic anvil from New Olympus. So just such cool ideas. And I love like this visual as he's scattering the suns. They almost look like little solar systems that he's throwing out that this Sun Eater is eating. And the Sun Eater will be very important in the story later on in other issues. And then so we get this big setup here where now Lois sees something she probably wasn't supposed to see. And the true horror element of what was teased on the cover now comes into play if she says, but now we come to the part of the story of my life where things go wrong. It wasn't my fault. The door was open. I know I wasn't supposed to go to see inside that weird room, but I did. And this is also kind of why I said like Beauty and the Beast. This kind of reminds me of, Beast had his room that Belle wasn't supposed to go in. It's very like fairy tale-esque, but it kind of like starts to put this idea in her head of like, okay, well, what is Superman planning? And she sees in this room that one of his robots has all these like layouts of Lois and like her skeleton, and he's like making something very strange in this big beaker. And so she starts getting very worried about what she just saw. And we also see that there's like a trail of smoke and like chemicals coming out of this room. And so she sees it and she gets scared by Superman coming up behind her. He's like, it's not what you think, Lois. Don't go in there. You can go anywhere in the fortress, but this room is off limits. Trust me. And then so closes the door, gets her out of there. Oh man, what a cool spread, right? This ad is like so nostalgic. This is cool. This is just like such a great, it's a history of Mario Kart, Super Mario Kart, all the way up into the 2005 release of Mario Kart DS, which I had a DS, I had this game, had a couple of these other games as well, but really great ad. I love like just the graphic design of it, and it's so much fun, the checker print in the background. Oh, this is great. If you're a Mario Kart fan or a Nintendo fan, this is a really cool like time capsule, and just really kind of cool time capsule of graphic design too. Really interesting that this doesn't line up. That was probably a mistake, right? But that was supposed to line up. Everything else lines up. So kind of continues. It's just getting a little bit more mysterious. Lois is getting a little bit more questioning, and maybe she's never been invited this intimately into Superman's home or like his life. So she's just kind of seeing him in a new lens. They're having this dinner in the actual Titanic, and he comes out and he's like in this like cloaked cape, which he doesn't normally wear, but he says that it's a traditional Kryptonian formal wear from the 4th age. I made it myself. And she says, I didn't know you could sew. He said, I thought I should learn. My trip to the sun did more than triple my strength, Lois. It tripled my curiosity, my imagination, my creativity. What a cool idea. Like, that is amazing. That's probably one of my favorite parts or lines of this issue. Like, why think of Superman as just like a muscle-bound brute? Like, yeah, what would Superman... I think there's a joke, right, in Seinfeld about, like, does Superman have, like, super humor or, like, super comedy? Like, would he be super at everything? And, like, this is, like, Superman saying, like, well, I got supercharged, and now I've got a super imagination. I think that's so cool. Like, that's what Superman can inspire us to do, right, is think of a better future. And Superman himself is now thinking, I can do more. I should do more. I want to do more before I'm gone. We get an interesting little hint at maybe something being off with Lois, as now she's seeing him. We're seeing this view. This is a Lois POV, and she's seeing Superman in black and white. And they don't really explain it yet, but it just kind of feels a little off. So she's saying, it's also made you 3 times more honest. Is that what I'm supposed to believe? Spare me the suspense, Superman. When do Clark and Jimmy and Perry pop out of the salt and pepper shakers and yell, "Happy birthday"? And that is another thing. This is like Lois's birthday. Or Lois's birthday is about to happen. So she is kind of like suspecting that maybe they're all planning something. He's still trying to convince her. He says, "Lois, please, I am Clark. Aren't you happy your suspicions were right all along?" But she just feels like something's off. Why would I be happy? Anyway, what about the times that Clark was a witness in the Boss Grimwald trial? Or you accompanied him everywhere as his bodyguard? Batman was standing in for me. Or the time that Clark presented you with the Metropolis Man of the Millennium Award, a robot. So just kind of like debunking all the ways that he fooled her in the past. Please, I know how it might have seemed, but those were ruses to protect you. Clark Kent and Superman are one and the same person. I swear I wouldn't lie to you. Don't swear, because if you were Clark, if Clark Kent were secretly Superman, or the other way around, whatever, if it was all a ruse, that would mean you've been lying to me for years, wouldn't it? So why confide in me now after all this? So I think that is a really great human element to bring into this relationship that they've been having for like almost 80 plus years of this back and forth. Like, this is such a human reaction for Lois to be having. Like, I've been lied to, you're hurting me with this, and it hurts almost more to know that I was right because you've been lying. And so she leaves, goes back to her room. Superman goes to his mirror of truth, which, still is more like fairy tale. It's more like Snow White with the magic mirror, or even like Beast with his falling petals. But he goes to the mirror of truth, and he's holding his glasses, his Clark Kent glasses, and he looks at himself as Clark Kent. We see that he drops his shoulders. He falls into that Frank Quietly Clark Kent, and when he looks into the mirror of truth, he sees Superman. He knows that Clark is the lie. He is Superman. And I love that. I love how it's repeated here. He's even more into the position, but what we're seeing in the mirror of truth is Superman, not Clark. And so he drops the glasses and leaves. I think this is also a really interesting element for Lois, and she says, "You know what would be worse? What if he's telling the truth? What if there really was some part of him that was the bumbling, oafish Clark Kent? I just don't know if I could live with that." And that's a really interesting element to this too. Like, we've seen kind of her be more humanized here. And now she's even thinking like, I love Superman. I've never loved Clark. If Clark is a piece of Superman, does she love Superman the same way still? So she has to be ready. I need to protect myself. I need a weapon just in case something happens. And so she runs into the armory, and she knows that Clark or Superman told her that this was a kryptonite gun. So she's going to go get that. But when she's there, she hears a transmission come in from the future, from that machine she was showed earlier. And we see that it's a different Superman came in, and it is the unknown Superman of 4500 AD. And this is kind of a nod to the Unknown Soldier, which was a old DC like war hero. And I love the logo play is so cool with the question mark, how it still kind of has that top little notch, just like the Superman S, but it's turned into a question mark. I think that's an amazing design choice from Frank Quietly. Also just like such a cool element, kind of like Hush or the Unknown Soldier of like the wrapped bandages. It's just so like evocative. It's such a cool Superman that we get introduced to here. This Superman comes into play in later issues too. So I want to discuss him a little bit more in that issue. I don't want to kind of like spoil that for this. His identity is unknown. There is kind of an identity we are given later, but I think that throughout this issue we're shown 2 different versions of this Superman. I think this is the true, real version of the unknown Superman, but we'll get back into that when that comes up in the story later. But She asks the unknown Superman, will Superman and I ever marry and have children? I need to know. And he doesn't really give her an answer. He says, the horrible answer is before you. So, I mean, maybe he does. That is an answer, right? Of like a generation. He's like, I am a byproduct of what you guys will eventually, what your union brings. And says, now, my question. Future must know. Great conundrum. And like, wait, what do you mean? Answer first. Reception poor. Here, listen close. Listen carefully. And then, as this is happening, the two robot assistants come in. And I think this is kind of like something that gets a little lost in translation. And I do think something that maybe Grant Morrison doesn't get credit for is like their use of humor. Because there's a joke here. So we get kind of like this ominous setup of like, she asks a question with a lot of gravitas to a lot of, it's heavy. And then his question back is, who was J-Lo? So he's asking who J-Lo is, Jenny from the Block. I don't know if it's like even more like that reference maybe would have made even more sense in like the early 2000s when this was made. I mean, J-Lo is still relevant, right? But I just think that's really funny that like he has this like call that he needs to make to the past, and his question is, who was J-Lo? Pretty good. I think that's pretty funny. It's like, why would he have needed to know that? Or like, what great conundrum in the future would that answer solve? But so the connection's cut off. She doesn't even tell him who J-Lo was, and she runs away, even more afraid now because Superman's little worker bees are coming to get her after she broke the rules. She grabs the kryptonite gun. Oh man, I love this drawing. I know we've talked about like, you want to show speed in driving chase scene or just showing a car moving, get those wheels off the ground. You want to show somebody really booking it while they're running, get their feet off the ground. This is amazing just for a human running with intent, and you can kind of feel her just like her anxiety and how much her necessity of movement. I think it's a really great gesture drawing right there. Frank Quitely kills it. So she rounds the corner. She's got the gun now. And I know he knows I know. He saw a vision of his own future in there. And so she's kind of getting even more caught up in this. Whatever he's become, whatever lurches out of that room, I have to be ready for it. And I think she's also kind of thinking that maybe that wrapped up Superman could be him from the future. Or like maybe something happens. Like, what if that really was really him, transformed into a monster, so awful he had to hide his face and lie about his deformity? So, really like now we've fully gotten there. He has become the beast. He has become the monster in this story to her. And so she's running. Maybe he's in this room. Maybe he's already become what she's afraid of. And we come around from the anvil, and we see that room that she originally got the peek into, and we see that it has a sign that says, keep out, Superman at work, and she's thinking, God forgive me, he has to be stopped. Everything that's kind of built up to her to this moment has led her to believe that Superman is lying to her, and that he is not saying or being who he says he is. He's not Clark. He's this monster now. And so she yells, Superman! And getting him to come out. The door opens. She's just so afraid now, and she blasts him with the kryptonite gun, which, could be absolutely horrible. But, ow. And she's surprised. Oh, Superman, what have I done? And he says, interesting way to discover I've become immune to green kryptonite radiation. Tickles. So, the evolution has of his powers has done something even more. And, I got so caught up in the story. I did want to point out this really funny Comedy Central ad about like this number that you could text the word booty to 22422, and it would give you daily pickup lines delivered to your cell phone. So that I remember like texting numbers like that to get answers about stuff, before we had Google on our phones and stuff. But really funny ad. So takes, he's not mad at her for doing this. He takes the gun. Robot 7, he's explaining what had happened. Now we get kind of the answer. We are still, all these issues, although they are connected, they are kind of like one and done. This is a collection of 12 issues that kind of do contain stories. And this is, like I was saying, is kind of like our version of Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane. And so he's kind of explaining what happened in this issue now. So He says Robot 7 had a processing problem, and when he left that door to the lab open, synthetic chemicals that were being synthesized leaked out, and she absorbed those chemicals, and they can cause visual distortions and extreme paranoid reactions. So that is our explanation for why she's been feeling this way now about Superman, like not trusting him fully. Although she had her questions in the beginning, even before she got there, I think they became a lot more compounded and worse after this exposure. And so she says, but that awful room with the dissecting machine. And he says, that was a super sewing machine. It uses diamond-tipped needles to weave light, indestructible thread. So kind of like a Superman suit creator machine. Sorry I kept disappearing, but I wanted to make your birthday present. And at 6 billion letters, it takes even me a long time to read and memorize an entire DNA code. And he says, you almost spoiled my surprise, but I guess you can come on in now. These new exogenes I've been making allow a human being to duplicate my powers for 24 hours. I was trying to keep it a secret, like that identity of mine, but this is for you. This is also, I know I was saying that the colors are really different throughout this. Look at like how much more saturated this whole sequence becomes. Really, really different. I do think this is kind of like the better interpretation. Although I usually love, to see what the original colors are like. I do think maybe they came back and fixed a little bit of this. This is a different paper stock, it's not like glossy, it's a little bit of newsprinty. So maybe it is just how these colors are kind of like these colors are how they're sitting on here. But I think you can see there's kind of just like a little bit of more blue throughout all these browns and everything. So I wonder if that was just kind of like early digital coloring. Something went wrong with the file prep, or maybe even like after they saw it, they came back and tweaked it. They wanted to make it more warm rather than cool. But there's some really weird stuff here where like they went back and they colored in the Lois Lane blueprint and then also colored in the skeleton blueprint, which I think it works just fine as a line art. So that's the one part that I'm like, why'd you do that? I don't know if that's really as necessary, but interesting color changes there. So gives her the formula and says, happy birthday, Lois Lane. So his birthday present to Lois is that he's going to give her superpowers for 24 hours, and they can she'll finally be able to experience life as Superman sees it and know him a little bit more. And he made her a Superwoman suit. And we get to be continued, which is, I think, also something that we lose in the trade. I don't know why we're always cutting this kind of stuff, just trying to pretend like it's not a comic, I guess. But you can see how the skeleton is colored in. I think it's a little distracting. It's kind of like the solid color next to her, whereas the line art lets her stand out a little bit more. So I probably wouldn't have done that, but they definitely made his reds much richer. And I think that just kind of plays into like, this kind of Lois Lane comic idea of like her getting superpowers, her kind of playing up that idea of like that Silver Age idea of like heroes experiencing getting and losing powers a lot of the time, or side characters getting that kind of stuff. So I do think that's another nod to like what this issue was trying to do. Even more, it was trying to be a Silver Age comic. And we also end on this really great Kong video game ad. A lot of video game ads throughout this. I think that is kind of telling of like where things were moving and kind of ads that comics were getting at the time. But I had this for DS as well. I really liked this game. You had like a gun and you're shooting like a bunch of like the velociraptors and stuff that were on the island. Yeah, a lot of fun. So this was a look at All-Star Superman 2, kind of where Grant moves into like Superman as a horror figure. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this coverage. And please come back for my coverage of issue 3. And we'll see where the rest of this series goes. And if you'd like comics and you want to support my work beyond just watching my videos, which I really appreciate, I am also a cartoonist. And if you want to check out my comics, you can find these at DaneGeorges.com. I've got my series, Doom Skull, which I have 3 issues currently self-published of. Issue 4 is on the way. This is about an ex-supervillain that works at the grocery store with his minion Bag Boy. And then I've also got a few zines. I've got The Passenger, which is about Picking Up a Hitchhiker and Everything Goes Wrong. That's a horror zine. I've got Sleepless Sights, which is about a guy's cat who gets out of his apartment and he has to chase it down, and he runs into all this kind of dreamlike, surrealistic horror. And then I've got Jiggly-Bub, which is about a piece of gum that God spits out. And I've also got X-Ray, which is a collection of my webcomics that I would post on Instagram, Tapastic, Webtoons, along with Revenge of the Holozine, which I've got a 5-page story in there, which is a collection of Chicago cartoonists that we got this kickstarted. So if you want to check out all my work, all this is available at danegeorges.com. I've got that link in the description below. But thank you for checking out this episode, and remember to think and read dangerously. And I'll see you next time.